I never thought I'd be left out of my own family's celebration. But here I was, scrolling through social media, staring at pictures of my mother's grand housewarming party, a party I hadn't even been invited to. The pictures were everywhere. My mother, stepfather, and stepbrother, Derek, were smiling in a huge mansion that looked strangely familiar. My heart dropped as I zoomed in on the background. The tall oak tree, the white stone pathway, the house I grew up in. I felt my chest tighten. How did they get that house? My grandfather had left it to me. I was sure of it. Before he passed away 3 years ago, he told me, "This house will always be yours, Angela. No one can take it away." But my mother and stepfather had always been greedy. After Grandpa died, they pushed me out of the family and took everything for themselves. And now, they were celebrating in my house, without me. I clenched my fists. My mother's Instagram caption read, "So happy to finally call this house our home. We worked so hard for this. Family is everything." Family? They never treated me like family. A sickening wave of anger and betrayal washed over me. They were throwing a party in a house that legally belonged to me. And they didn't even have the decency to invite me. Fine. If they wouldn't invite me, I'd invite myself. I grabbed my coat, stormed out of my apartment, and headed straight for the party. The drive to the mansion felt like forever. My heart pounded with every mile. I kept picturing my mother laughing, my stepfather bragging, and Derek, always so smug, acting like he owned the place. I pulled up to the long driveway, and my stomach turned. Luxury cars lined the front yard. The place was filled with guests, all dressed in fancy clothes, sipping champagne. I could hear laughter and music spilling from inside. This wasn't just a small housewarming. It was a celebration of their victory. I walked toward the door, my heels clicking on the stone pathway. As I reached for the handle, a security guard stepped in front of me. "Invitation?" he asked, looking me up and down. I glared at him. "I don't need one. This is my house." The guard smirked. "Ma'am, you need to step back. This is Mr. and Mrs. Miller's home. If you don't have an invite, you can't come in." Mr. and Mrs. Miller. Hearing my mother and stepfather's names on this house made my skin crawl. Before I could argue, a familiar voice called from inside. "Oh, look who's here." I turned and saw Derek, my stepbrother, standing in the doorway with a cocky grin. His suit was expensive, his watch even more so. He looked rich. Off my inheritance. "What are you doing here, Angela?" he sneered, crossing his arms. "Came to see what real success looks like." Rage boiled inside me. "What are you doing in my house?" Derek laughed. Actually laughed. He turned toward the guests. "Everyone, meet my jealous stepsister. She's still mad because she got nothing." The guests chuckled, mocked me. I felt a lump form in my throat, but I refused to let them see me break. "You think this is funny?" I said through clenched teeth. "Yeah," Derek shrugged. "You're embarrassing yourself. Mom and Dad worked hard for this house. Just because Grandpa used to let you live here doesn't mean you own it." That's when I saw her, my mother. She was smiling, a champagne glass in her hand, looking like the perfect hostess. When our eyes met, she didn't flinch. She just gave me a cold, fake smile. "Angela," she said smoothly, "I didn't think you'd show up. You were never part of our plans." Her words hit harder than a slap. I took a deep breath. "You stole this house from me." "Stole." She laughed, shaking her head. "Oh, sweetie, you were never meant to have it." Something inside me snapped. I reached into my purse and pulled out a folder of documents. "Actually," I said, holding them up, "this house is still mine. Legally." The entire room fell silent. The smug smiles on my mother's and Derek's faces froze. My stepfather, standing beside her, suddenly looked less confident. The guests, who had been laughing just seconds ago, exchanged confused glances. "What did you just say?" my mother asked, her voice tight. I took a step forward, holding up the documents. "This is Grandpa's original will. The house was never yours. It was left to me. You've been living here illegally." A hush fell over the crowd. Derek let out a nervous chuckle. "That's nonsense. Mom and Dad inherited everything when Grandpa died. You were just a tenant. I smirked. Oh, really? Then, why does this legal document say otherwise? I held up the papers. Grandpa transferred this house to my name before he passed away. You never owned it. And unless you have proof saying otherwise, you're all trespassing. My mother's face turned pale. My stepfather clenched his jaw. Derek's smirk disappeared. One of the guests, an older man in a suit, spoke up. Wait a second. If this is true, then legally, this house belongs to her. Gasps spread across the room. I turned to my mother. So? What's your next lies? She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Then my stepfather snapped. That paper means nothing, he growled, stepping toward me. We have our documents proving this house is ours. I arched an eyebrow. You mean the fake ones? Because I had my lawyer look into it. I waved another paper in the air. Turns out, the deed transfer you used was forged. That's a felony. The room exploded into whispers. My mother and stepfather were trapped. Everyone was staring at them now, not with admiration, but suspicion. That's ridiculous, my mother hissed. But her voice was shaky. I took another step forward. Oh, and did I mention? I brought someone with me. Right on cue, the front door swung open. My lawyer and 2 uniformed police officers walked in. My stepfather's face drained of color. My mother staggered back. Derek's hands curled into tight fists. Ladies and gentlemen, my lawyer announced, we have received substantial evidence of property fraud. This house legally belongs to Miss Angela. As of now, the current occupants are considered squatters. My mother gasped. Furthermore, one of the officers continued, there's an ongoing investigation into the illegal transfer of assets. If found guilty, the responsible parties could face criminal charges. Silence. Then chaos. The room exploded into panic. Guests started murmuring, backing away from my mother and stepfather like they were diseased. The ones who had mocked me just minutes ago now looked at me with shock and fear. Derek stepped forward, furious. This is a joke, he spat. Mom, Dad, say something. But my mother was frozen. Her lips trembled, her hands clenched around her champagne glass like she might shatter it. My stepfather wasn't as silent. This is our home, he bellowed, pointing a finger at me. Angela, you can't just walk in here with some phony papers and try to kick us out. The officer nearest to him sighed. Sir, this is not up for debate. If you refuse to vacate, we will be forced to remove you. I crossed my arms, enjoying every second of their downfall. You stole my house, you threw a party to celebrate it, and now you're trying to act like the victims? I let out a short laugh. Pathetic. Derek lunged toward me, face red with rage. You little... 2 officers stepped in, blocking him. Touch her, and you'll be charged with assault, one of them warned. Derek stopped, breathing hard. He looked like he wanted to punch a wall. My mother finally found her voice. Angela, please. She stepped forward, eyes wide and pleading. Don't do this. We're family. I tilted my head. Family? I let the words sit in the air for a moment before shaking my head. You threw me away when Grandpa died, I said coldly. You let them push me out, call me nothing. And now, when you're caught, you remember we're family? Tears welled up in her eyes. We didn't mean to hurt you. I stared at her for a long moment. Then, I turned to the officers. Evict them. Now. The next 20 minutes were pure chaos. The police escorted my mother, stepfather, and Derek out of the house. They tried to argue, tried to fight, but they had no choice. Their guests watched, whispering in disbelief. A few even recorded the scene on their phones. My mother begged, Angela, please. Where will we go? I shrugged. Not my problem. As they were forced out onto the front steps, Derek snapped. You're a monster, Angela, he shouted. You ruined everything. I smiled sweetly. No, Derek. I just took back what was mine. Then came the final blow. The moment they were kicked out, I turned to the guests. Since they're no longer the owners, I raised my voice. The party is over. Everyone get out. The shocked guests started grabbing their coats and hurrying out. Within minutes, the massive house, my house, was silent. I stood in the center of the grand living room, finally at peace. This was my home again, and they were gone. A week later, I walked through my mansion, making plans for renovations. But then I got one final surprise. A letter arrived from my lawyer. Inside was another document from my grandfather's estate. He had left me a hidden bank account, worth over $2 million. I stared at the number, my hands shaking. Not only had I gotten my house back, but I was now wealthy beyond anything my mother, stepfather, or Derek had ever imagined. As I looked around my reclaimed home, I smiled. I had won, and they would never take anything from me again.